For me personally, one of the things that's got to give if we're to bring about change for people with eating disorders is the way in which medical discourse and this idea that anorexia and bulimia and other eating disorders are just mental illnesses like any other illnesses. For me, this medical discourse has come to dominate the conversation about eating disorders, and this has to change. When I ask you about stigma and eating disorders, the first thing you probably think of is the myth that eating disorders are something that simply vain young girls who read too many fashion magazines get. And yet, whilst this kind of stigma does still exist, for the most part, people are beginning to see eating disorders in a new light. Increasingly, people recognise that eating disorders are a mental illness just like any other serious illness. But for me, herein lies the problem. So why did we push for eating disorders to be seen as mental illnesses within the medical model in the first place? Much of the stigma surrounding eating disorders comes from the idea that eating disorders are a choice, something that we bring upon ourselves. The medical model steps around this to say that nobody chooses to have an eating disorder. Eating disorders have a biological, neurological, and/or genetic basis, and these are something that the sufferers have no control over. In other words, we hear this message that sufferers cannot help the way their brain works. The idea is to reduce stigma by separating the person from the disorder, so that we can recognise that the way that they act, speak, and feel are simply symptoms of them being seriously ill. However, what we're brushing over as we reproduce this medical discourse is the way in which illnesses are stigmatised, and therefore we're consolidating this stigmatised pathological identity. Many studies have shown that whilst we're giving lip service to destigmatising mental illness, the stigma is there, it is real, and it has an enormous impact on social relations. Placing so much emphasis on the biological difference of people with eating disorders has the effect of suggesting there is something fundamentally wrong with that person. It inscribes a thoroughly pathological identity whereby everything that person says or does is simply a symptom of the eating disorder. Rather than eliciting the empathy needed to effectively engage with those sufferers, what we're seeing is increased aversion and increased social distancing. Parents, friends, and carers are told to stand up to the eating disorder, to recognise when it's the eating disorder speaking, and to refuse to be manipulated by the illness. And yet, I struggle to think of any other illness that we treat with such hostility and animosity as we end up showing towards those who are suffering with eating disorders. Being identified, labelled, and thus stigmatised as someone who is seriously mentally ill can have a profound effect on someone's identity. Anorexia and bulimia are actually really rare examples of where illness comes to be determined as an identity. That is to say, the person with anorexia is an anorexic, and therefore the way that they speak and the way that they behave is in an anorexic manner. This all-consuming identity, coupled with the understanding that their eating disorder is a facet of their biology and something that they have no control over, actually leads them to feel that their condition is unalterable. In a fantastic study by a guy called Nicholas Farrell in November just last year, they basically managed to show that biological explanations for eating disorders were increasing levels of self-blame and reduced people's expectations for recovery. Now, whilst these medical insights are doing brilliant work to progress overall treatment structures, what we need to really think about is that until we're able to make better practical use of biomedical insights, are these really of help or of hindrance to those who are in recovery? One of the major problems with locating eating disorders in the biology of an individual sufferer is that it overlooks and fails to acknowledge how eating disorders are often emerging in response to a particular set of social, cultural, or personal circumstances. Medical explanations alone cannot capture the complexity, the diversity, and the lived reality of these unique experiences. Looking at culture in relation to eating disorders involves going beyond discussions of the media and beyond unrealistic body ideals. It means really digging into the ways in which gender, age, ethnicity, sexuality, socioeconomic status, political forces like capitalism and neoliberalism are playing massive parts to shape people's lives and experiences. And these conversations are going to be challenging, they're going to be unfamiliar, and perhaps at times painful. but they're essential to understanding eating disorders in the context in which they're really playing out. What we really need is a paradigm shift on behalf of medical professionals and treatment providers to realise that patient perspectives and experiences may be radically different from and distant to the medical model that they're comfortable and familiar with. It's going to require humility to go into these open, honest conversations with sufferers and to recognise what they have to say and be prepared to recognise the fact that many patients have developed a sophisticated and practical understanding of what has or hasn't worked for them in the past. We know that treatment alliance is the #1 predictor of a positive treatment outcome. And so professionals need to understand that collaborating with the eating disordered patient is not colluding with the eating disorder. In calling for a re-evaluation of how we use medical discourse in the treatment of eating disorders, what I'm ultimately asking for is that people's lived, embodied experiences are honoured and respected, and that we recognise that expert knowledge and experiential knowledge can come together to produce unique, individualised and effective treatment that goes beyond what a biomedical perspective alone has to offer. Thank you.